Hello, Daniel.
Hello, Robin. How are you doing?
All right, it's a bright, sunny winter morning here.
Yeah,
And
yeah. In the and I'm in Maryland, so I similar weather to where you are. Um, yeah, so we've been both very interested in the demographic crisis that we seem to see more obviously than a lot of people, even a lot of policymakers and leaders.
so I haven't maybe been in it as long as you, but 6 months or so ago, I realized this one fact, and that made the issue much bigger for me. And I'm not sure how to communicate to other people just how big it seems now that I've thought about it more. Maybe that's one of our key issues here. How do we persuade people that it's a big issue? So the thing that brought me to seeing it bigger was the idea that if fertility continued to fall, according to the trend it seems to be on worldwide, population would then fall. It seems to be on schedule to fall in 3 decades or so. And then the economy would fall in terms of the total size of the economy, not necessarily per person. And as the economy fell, innovation would fall. The rate of innovation would fall proportionally to the economy. So if the economy was 1/10 the previous peak, then the rate of innovation would be even less than 1/10 of that. And so, as an economist, I'm very aware of how much innovation matters to the world and
Yes.
has mattered. And that's really shocking to realize that, population could fall and go for several centuries at least with a very low innovation rate. That's, a
Yeah,
shocking scenario.
and I think as far as I can tell, you're almost alone in the world in seeing that. I think part of that is that you like to think, deeply about the far future and
Well,
not
so
just
I'm following actually an economist, a much more famous economist than I, who wrote a paper on this, who I think most other economists in that world would grant that it looks plausible, his analysis. Maybe they would, pick issues with his assumptions or whatever. But I think among the
which
some,
economist is that?
well, now you're going to stump me because I'm not good with names, but I'll look it up for you here while we're talking. But it's it's not my thing. I'm just saying what other economists say, really.
Because I think most people don't really understand that. And I think Brian Kaplan made a he wrote a book about urging people to have more children some time ago, your colleague Brian Kaplan, and he had an incredible um quote in there that I've cited before, which is where he talks about how uh, when innovation is based on innovation thrives on more people because if you have more people, you'll have more geniuses,
Right.
you'll have more Edisons, you'll have more Einsteins, you'll so uh, and one of the greatest books which I have here on my shelf, Julian Simon, of course,
Sure.
we know that he the ultimate resource, of course, is people, especially innovative,
Right.
creative
But
people who are.
but I think many people reason like this. So I might say, look, back in 1900, we had, I don't know, less than 2 billion people on the planet. Now we've got 8. We looked like we had a lot of innovation back in 1900. So if the population fell by a factor of 4, it couldn't be that bad because look how much innovation we had back then. So I don't think
Yeah.
people quite realize that there's diminishing returns here. That is, as the economy gets much bigger, you might think we would have much more innovation, which in some sense we do, but then you might think the growth rate would be much higher too, which it's not. So, as the economy gets bigger, we are able to innovate more, but we took the low-hanging fruit first.
Right, right,
So
right. And
so
that's
we have a headwind there. And so if we go back to the population of 1900, we won't have the same
yeah, there was
perceived rate of innovation there.
a lot of much lower hanging fruit. I mean, most people didn't have running water. I don't think almost
Right.
anybody had any electricity. There was, let alone any kind of modern communications. I think people were tapping out signals. Uh, and that was kind of a cool thing that most people didn't even have access to. I think that you had the telephone that had been invented, but I don't even think that had been widely dispersed yet.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
I think a
yeah.
lot of people will look at this innovation claim and even if they believe it, they go, yeah, okay, fine. Innovation will go away. That's not such a bad world. It's not such a terrible price to pay for not destroying nature, right? They'll think we'll have a much lower burden on the environment if we have a lower population. And they also might think, I don't know, international tensions would go down because we don't have to fight over land as much, or, I think people don't quite see this as the crisis that you and I might. And so I, I think it's even more fundamentally we see a bunch of trends, social trends contributing to this falling fertility. And if you itemize them, there's a lot of them, and they're pretty strong social trends in the sense that a lot of people like have a lot emotionally invested in them.
Yes, I hear you. I hear you. And this is something that I've thought about a lot. And I've, read everything you've written about fertility and birth rates to really try to, make sense of if there's a magic key, which I mean, I think, I would disagree with you a little bit. I don't know. I don't know if this is disagreement, but I had a post, the post was called Fertility and Culture, a deep dive, and it was apparently interesting enough that it got written about in the New York Times. So um, Ross Douthat, I don't know
Right.
how you.
I mean, I read your article there and his response.
Yeah.
Um,
So well,
but
I'll
I
talk
think you
about
were
just
only listing a small fraction of all the cultural trends that are pushing for lower
okay.
fertility.
Well,
You were
well,
focusing on a few of them. I mean,
yeah. The one that I really want to focus on is kind of cutting to the chase and talking about direct pronatal belief, just directly believing in the value of children. And the thing um, that really does this for me as an important factor uh, is Israel, because Israel is they're wealthy, they're very technological. Women are educated more than men in Israel. It's extremely expensive. It's very urban. So there's so many factors that, as you say, contribute to low fertility. But Israel has almost all of these factors. But the one thing that they do have in spades is a very strong pronatal belief. They simply and directly believe in having a lot of children. And I think, and my thesis of that post and that article that I wrote is that uh, we kind of have an antenatal culture that's kind of a global culture that where
so
you ask young people, is it a good idea to have children? They're not clear if it is, and that's kind of I think that would be a shocking thing to people in other eras. And I think you can compare, you know, it's kind of hard to compare because we in modern times, because there's kind of a global culture. But that is my thesis, is that if you have a more pronatal belief, you can have much higher birth rates. And related to that, we do have much more stronger headwinds for fertility than we ever have in the past, because of all these factors you talk about, especially modern birth control, which is really excellent, and nobody wants to ban birth control. Or that I think that would be a very politically unpopular opinion. Um, that said, uh, so I think that the answer is that we have to, uh, if we are to solve this, which and is not at all clear that we will, but we would have to, you know, have be intensively pronatal, simply believe deeply that it's extremely important to have children the way Israel does, and that's how they overcome this long
so
laundry list of factors.
I just want to mention I looked up the name. It was Chad Jones. He's the economist who wrote a paper on falling fertility and how that involves innovation. On Israel, um, so there's the surveys widely done about people's ideal number of children, and those haven't fallen nearly as much as the actual number of children. Is Israel different on that number in terms of their ideal? Or what is concretely the evidence that they have this different natal attitude, other than the fact they have a higher fertility? I mean, like, is What else is
Well,
there that we
I
could
mean,
identify in Israel?
anecdotally, I know, you know, a
Is there a
large number.
survey of some sort we could see that how they respond differently to?
Um, I don't have that in front of me. I have talked to, you know, countless uh Jews and Israeli people in the United States. I haven't been to Israel yet. I'm going to need to go there, I'm sure, just because it's the most one of the most demographically interesting countries for for
Right.
and for other reasons. But there is, people will talk to you right away. Every time I've asked this question of any Israeli or and most American Jews will say the same thing, is, people simply deeply believe in having children. And one of my son plays baseball. He had one of his best friends at the time was also on the team, and I don't think they were fully Orthodox Jewish, but I think they were fairly conservative Jewish. I was sitting in the stands next to his mother, who I was friends with, and I'm friends with. I asked her, what do you think? I'm very interested in that. Why do you think uh, Israelis have such a high birth rate? And she said, there's this thing that we say, for those that were lost, have one more. And I
Right.
almost choked up
So,
when I
so,
heard that.
so that's pointing to another cause, right? I mean, so it seems like this general, added the fertility rate is pretty closely related to sort of people's overall attitude toward fertility, but we want to talk about what factors are contributing to that. Uh, so you're pointing to one of them, which is a common explanation people have offered in the past, which is embattled places where they feel like the world is against them and fighting them, then they are more eager to have kids. And there was the birth boost in Europe after World War I and World War II, uh, plausibly related to Europe being in a big war. So
Yeah,
that
there is a siege mentality, and Lyman Stone does talk a lot about that. And I would encourage everybody, by the way, he is, I think, arguably the most knowledgeable demographer, like, in existence that I know of. He just in term he's uncovered so many factors that are related to fertility. And I know him. I think he's brilliant and a great guy. So he has talked about that. Um, but I think uh, there are so the siege mentality is definitely a thing, but that's not the only thing. And in my paper I talk about, or my article, I talk about some other examples. And another very interesting example is the example of Mongolia. You can compare Outer Mongolia and Inner Mongolia. Now, Outer Mongolia is what we consider the country of Mongolia. Inner Mongolia is the part of China that's adjacent to Outer Mongolia, has a lot of the same ethnic groups, and the fertility in Outer Mongolia is about 3 births per woman. The fertility of Inner Mongolia is about 0.75 births per woman, so South Korea level. So you have a factor of 4 difference between Inner and Outer Mongolia. Now, what is the difference? Outer Mongolia, which again is Mongolia proper these days, was under Soviet influence, so they had the communist influence and all of that. But the difference between the Soviet culture and Soviet cultural propaganda versus Chinese culture and cultural propaganda, and of course the one-child policy, one was pushing pronatalism directly, one was pushing antinatalism directly. And even though the Soviet Union is no more, and China no longer has this one-child policy, the shadow of this is incredibly long. So you now have uh, a a fertility rate 4 times
but
as high in Outer Mongolia as you do in Inner Mongolia.
so I and many other academics just worry about focusing too much on selected examples rather than just overall statistics. I mean, this is true for growth rates and many other sort of world comparisons. We long ago got wary of picking examples and saying, it should be like this. Let's just look at the overall trend and what the
Well, I
overall
mean,
correlates are.
this is,
So,
I don't think it's going really that far out on a limb, because Occam's razor would say uh, the, it makes perfect sense that the biggest factor in how many uh,
okay,
children somebody would
but I
have is
mean, so
what they
something about
believe
Soviet
about
and
that.
Chinese culture, but like those are big, complicated things. So when we're trying to say what it is it about Soviet and Chinese culture that makes these differences,
So in the Soviet Union, they simply and very directly encouraged people to have more children. They had medals, and it exists to this day. The
right?
Order of Maternal Glory, where they would actually give
Right, but
prizes to
most of the
people.
ex-Soviet Union has pretty low fertility these days. So, inherited Soviet culture isn't that pro-fertility.
I don't know. You see this in other, Soviet, the countries like Kazakhstan also, and its neighbors, have remarkably high fertility So I think there is I really do believe that culture
Okay, but
is a much.
those are selected parts of the Soviet Union, right?
I will
Again,
give
if you
another.
look at Soviet Union as a whole, it's not high fertility, right? Today.
It's not high. I would argue that it could be a lot lower. There was a big shift in one thing that's very interesting is actually after the Soviet Union uh ended, you know, in so many countries that had had, very pronatal messaging and pronatal propaganda as they had had in the Soviet Union, when they transitioned, almost everyone saw their
Okay.
fertility
So
plummet. Okay, I
like
have one more example that I want to give, but I'll let it rest. But one of the to me, one of the best examples that we find about, to illustrate the power of culture is in the 1800s between France and England. So at the beginning of the 1800s, in France, you had the French Revolution, and that was an anti-clerical revolution in part. And the result was in the 1800s, you had generally a fairly antenatal culture in France, whereas in England, in Victorian England, Victorian England is known for sexual uh, prudishness. That's like a there. When we think of sexual prudishness, that's what our minds go to, but that is actually they actually had very conservative values, and they were very pronatal to you. I think there was a trial that called the Bradlaugh-Besant trial that where people who were spreading information about birth control were prosecuted, and that shows how incredibly seriously they took pronatalism in Victorian England, and the result was that during the 1800s, England grew by a factor of 4. During the 1800s, France essentially saw their population not increase at all, and then we had the events of the 20th century. I think that
so
there.
so
Go
the,
on.
the issue here is, I mean, we see falling fertility, we see fertility varies. I want to like take that apart and talk about the social factors that contribute to that. You say, oh, well, there's just one factor, it's
Oh no,
pronatalism.
there's
And I
many.
want to say, no, we
I
need to
talk
take that
about
apart, right?
I talk about many factors, and
But that's what I want to do right now. I want us to talk about the many factors, not just whether it's pronatal or whether there's pronatal messaging. I'm fine to say propaganda is one of the many effects, but it's not that big.
Well, no,
Uh,
I don't think I think it actually is very big. And that's kind of my thesis, is that we try all these things. Something that's really disappointing to a lot of people is that Scandinavia is now clocking in with some. Finland has shockingly low fertility now. They were supposed to be the example
Okay, but
of. And,
even if pronatal propaganda is a big deal, it
well,
doesn't happen unless the culture wants it to happen. So we have to look at the other factors that
well,
cause pronatal propaganda, right?
my thesis is that we have kind of an antenatal culture that's not really
But we
that we
want to
don't.
take that apart. What causes an antenatal culture? That's the whole point. What we want to look at the contributing factors, and there are many we can identify that are pretty concrete that contribute to pro versus antenatal cultures. And there's a whole literature on the difference between England and France and what were the factors that contributed there. And there's a whole literature in the last century of all the different factors that have contributed to different countries having higher or lower fertility. So it seems like that's the place to start, is what can we identify as the factors that have contributed to pro versus antenatal cultures and fertility.
Sure, sure. Um, one of the biggest factors, you know, but it's not the only one, but it is certainly an important one, is of course religiosity.
Yes, so I'm happy to take that right. So religiosity is clearly a big factor, and that was, say, the standard first factor that contributed to the French decline,
Yes,
is declining fertility there. And obviously,
definitely.
uh,
Um,
that's a factor all around the world, declining religion, and also sort of less fundamental religion in some sense. Fundamentalist religions seem to be higher fertility than otherwise, although that's at least in the exceptional cases. Um,
but I can elaborate a little bit on religion. It's not necessarily true, by the way, that religion has to be
no,
pronatal. And this is an interesting point. It is because there is, pronatal belief and pronatal teaching, especially in the Abrahamic faiths, there tends to strongly be, but this isn't necessarily true. And this is something I learned from a gentleman named Yi Fu Shan, who is, everybody should follow him and appreciate him. He is, I don't know if have you heard of him? Do you know who he is?
no,
He is, um, he is the somebody who has been a very vocal opponent of China's one-child policy, and he wrote he's based in the United States. He's an American academic, born in China, and he's written a lot, and he informed me that actually. And anyway, he's been instrumental in getting rid of China's one-child policy. He writes an extraordinary amount. But regarding religion, he explained uh, that Buddhism has traditionally had no
sure.
no pronatal belief, and he actually told me about Mongolia. He said the communists actually had to quash Buddhism in Mongolia before Mongolia could have that helps Mongolia actually to have higher fertility. So that was a very remarkable, interesting thing
Okay,
that he
so
told
let's
me.
refine this to say certain kinds of religions promote fertility and not all religion.
But the thing within those religions that promotes fertility is actually pronatal belief. And my point is then that, it is also possible to have, if you look at in Israel, it is not only the Orthodox and
Okay,
hyper
but
religious people that even secular atheist people in Israel have twice
so
the birth rate.
pronatal religious dogma is different than belief. That is, belief is just the thing we're trying to explain. But you might say, religious dogma can explain it, because religious dogma is something more fixed and harder to vary. Uh, so yes, some religions are explicitly in the dogma of the religion pronatal, and that's an explanatory factor for the cultures that accept those religions being pronatal,
Sure, sure.
right? But so you mentioned Ross Douthat, riffing on your essay. He had different theories he favored about key causes. He called it workism or something. But
Yes, I can
so
talk about that a little. Or, yes,
But I mean,
workism.
I'd like us to like go more quickly over the main factors so we can like see a long list of them, rather than I fear at this rate we're not even going to finish the list.
Okay, okay. Well, let me try then to just rush through a list of major factors for fertility. I focus on pronatalism because I really have a belief that is the most important factor, and that you can
But
have
that's
pronat.
just a summary of all the other factors. I want to
Well, no,
take
no. I would
pronatalism
say
apart.
no. Well, well, no. I don't. I think pronatalism is a separate factor because you can have, and this is what I
What
think
does it
Israel.
mean then as a
It
separate factor?
it is directly a belief that is
But beliefs aren't
super.
direct. They're a
No, I
result
mean,
of many other things, right?
no. If you can think it's very important to have children and be a religious person. You can think it's very important to have children and be an atheist. You can think it's, so you can be a feminist and think it's very important to have children. You can be a right wing conservative and think it's very important to have
Right.
children. My point is that simple belief is a separate factor that can
But
be,
let's
and it can
can
be
we call it
overlaid on.
approximate cause? We might think of proximate versus distal causes, right? I mean, in some sense, the most proximate cause is an intention to have a child, perhaps, or at least a failure to prevent having a child. And then as we move away from that in the causal structure of people's choices, we could get to a longer term belief that having a child is good. But then the question is, what are the other causal factors farther back in the causal chain that we can identify? And religion is one of those. It's not
I mean, okay,
immediately in the.
okay. Another factor in the causal chain is environmentalism, and particularly, there's a strong sense of environmental panic among young people. I mean, you can see people are
Okay,
go to
but
therapy.
that doesn't go on the top list of top five causes. So I want us to
I
start
would
with the
argue
top
that I
causes.
would argue that maybe it does, because if uh and this is something that I looked at. I looked at, the comments, there are articles in the New York Times and other major news sources on uh fertility and birth rates, and talking about this crisis, and you look at the comments, and overwhelmingly people, you know don't think it's a problem. They think it's a
So
good thing that there's less people. They think, oh, this is great, oh, wonderful, this is wonderful news, population is collapsing,
so
finally.
let me take the initiative to I will list factors that I think are mostly pretty obviously bigger contributions than that many people have mentioned. They're not original to me, that are have contributed to falling fertility. First of all, gender equality. You know, when we had more distinct gender roles where the female's role was fertility, then that was more pro fertility. Seems pretty obvious. Uh, Increasing parenting effort. That is, even the last few decades, some
Yes,
substantial
yes.
correlation across countries in expected parenting effort and actual parenting effort correlates quite substantially with fertility in that
Yeah, and Tim Carney has communicated a lot about that, and I'm a big
I can see
opponent of
that in my
travel.
life because
Yes, yes.
my son, and compared to how much he takes care of effort he puts on his daughter versus how much effort my parents put on me, I can see this long-term trend toward increasing parenting effort. Um, Another obvious one that many people mention is longer, stiffer career paths. Many women want to succeed in a career, and that means they have to follow established career path, which doesn't give time
Right,
off for
right,
kids. And they really honestly believe they could and want to succeed. They want to prove that they are successful, good, accomplished people, and that means they put off kids toward later in a career path where at some point in mythically that you could take time off, although there probably isn't really that much of such points in career paths. Like any time you take off at a career path, it hurts you substantially. Um, Capstone versus cornerstone marriage
right,
norms.
right.
Um, that, the norm that you should be, find yourself and form yourself and be a mature adult, know who you are and what you want, and then find somebody who matches that.
Yeah, I've written about the baby boom, actually, and that points to exactly the point that you just talked about. That was a time when when everybody was doing cornerstone marriages. Nobody did capstone marriages
Right.
back then. The average age at marriage in of marriage at the height of the baby boom, what do you think it was for women?
25,
It was
23.
20.
Ah, okay.
It was 20.
Very
So,
young.
I mean, you marry young, yeah, that, so
Yeah.
if you believe in early marriage, you know, it is very easy
Right.
to have a lot of children, because that you have
Right.
so many
So,
years.
I mean,
Go on.
another trend, perhaps a weaker effect, is just, uh, basically the single family by itself norm, which I'm not sure what the right name for, I forget the right word for that, but basically
The nuclear family as
the
opposed to
nuclear
the
family.
extended family. Yes, that
Right.
is.
So it used to be the extended family was more involved and therefore more financial support and more advice and more helping you choose a mate and more, helping you set up your
Yeah,
career.
I'm a big
And
believer that one interesting point related to that, the last the last two presidents before Biden, both Obama and Trump, had within their within the White House uh, grandparents. Uh,
right,
Trump had Melania's parents living in the White House helping to raise Barron, and Obama, within the Obama White House,
right,
Michelle Obama's uh, parents
right,
were present raising helping to raise Sasha and Malia. So there, and
right?
that's an important model that these that's good enough for presidents. So I think we can get back to that.
Right. And then I think you mentioned briefly before, we're more urban and housing prices are higher because of how we've regulated housing. And that, for most people, feels like something that discourages them from having kids because they feel like they want a lot more space, even outdoors, when they have kids, and they feel like they shouldn't have kids in a small city apartment.
Yeah, that is one of the strongest correlations you will ever find, and it's true in almost every country in the world. It's been true for hundreds of years that the more dense, the more urban, the lower the birth rates, the lower the fertility rates. This is almost like a
Right.
almost
So,
yes, yes.
right. So if we just look at these various trends we've identified, we can ask which of them seem basically how plastic, how open to reversal, and which sort of we can see by their structure that they are kind of stuck because there's all these social forces behind them, right? Like if we think, oh, well, let's just move people out of the cities into the countryside, we can immediately see how hard that's going to be, right? It's going to be, we can't
Although
just
there
have a
is
few op-eds about it. A few
yeah,
op-eds is not going to
I
do
do
that,
want to
right?
point out that there is a kind of a balance, which I really believe that one of America's greatest inventions of all time is the suburbs. Actually, because the suburbs give you and
Sure.
that is an
But the
area
suburbs
of
have been getting more expensive too because we have stronger housing
yeah,
regulations.
we should definitely build more suburbs. The inner city, you have some of the lowest fertility rates in the whole world. And this is true in the United States as well. Inner cities, where everybody lives in an urban high rise, have extremely low fertility rates.
Right.
If you can just
Okay.
get people out into a single family home, just like 30 miles out or 20 miles out, they can still be connected to that economy, and and nevertheless have a far higher birth rate. I've
Right.
published a lot related to that.
Okay, so I mean, my thesis that I suggest to you is there's a fertility trend and it's going down, and we're concerned about that. And then there's a near causal factor, which is how many kids do people plan or expect or want to have? That's their, fertility culture. And then there are these other factors we've just listed, which are more distal causes, which look pretty strong trends, which have a lot of social force behind them and a lot of emotional uh, support for them. And then we're asking ourselves, what's how plausible is it, or how could we imagine changing fertility via just changing, propaganda and op-eds and official pronouncements versus changing these fundamental trends that are pushing this way? Basically, there's two basic questions. What are the most promising ways to change that? But I think the more interesting question or more fundamental question is what's the prospect for actually changing this enough? Like there's a threshold here. If you don't get up to replacement, you just
You're
slow the decline, but you still
you're still going.
decline.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, this is why, and we'll move forward, but I do want to talk about Israel again because I do think that's our best hope
Can we get the whole
it,
world to be embattled?
well, I don't know.
A
It's
whole
not just
war against the
being,
world? Will that do
it's
it?
not just being, yeah, yes, they are embattled, and they feel, they went through a horrific tragedy, and we don't want to go through the history that the Jewish people experienced. That would be that was awful. And having said that, I think I think the fact of having strong, uh, they have so many of those factors that you mentioned are even worse in Israel. They are more expensive than any city, any place in Europe. They are more urbanized than almost any country. They're denser than almost any country. They're extreme. Are extremely technological, extremely feminist. So they have all these
What about
factors.
parenting effort? What about capstone versus career marriages? What about, grandparent involvement? How are those things in Israel?
Yeah, I am aware. I have talked to a lot of people who say that kind of the family support culture is a lot stronger, and I would argue that's also maybe more amenable to change than saying women can't work anymore. No, I don't think saying women can't work anymore is a viable uh, prospect. Related to women and careerism. By the way, I will say that what the best answer seems to be is a very open culture that is happy to support stay-at-home mothers and traditional models, that is also happy to support women that are working mothers. We see countries that try to impose traditionalism too much, like countries
Do they
like
have like
it,
less long, stiff career paths in Israel? I mean, again, I want to go to these more fundamental factors
well,
and
I,
ask,
I think Israel, it's extremely, life in Israel, I don't think is easy, but I think they have this determination to have children, in the culture that can kind of overpower a lot of cultural trends, which is why maybe this is a long shot for the world to get such intense pronatalism, but I think that is the best hope, is to go from a somewhat antenatal culture to a much more
so
strongly
let,
pronatal
let
culture.
me suggest to you a myth of activism or the activism fallacy. So there are these large, social forces underlying, society and history that move in some directions, and we can understand why if we get into them. And then often there's these trends. There's a famous saying that the way to be a leader is to find a crowd going somewhere and get out in front. Oh, and so in some sense, activists are the ones who find the crowd going somewhere and get out in front, and then they yell most loudly and most early for the things that everybody else is going to do naturally later. And then they tell the story that their yelling caused all the change, when in fact it was more underlying social forces. So you might tell, similar stories like this about feminism or anti-racism or,
Well, one thing about
women
well,
going, et cetera. That is,
I
there are these long-term social forces, and if you credit the activism, you just say, well, what the world needs to change is more activists yelling about things. But if in fact they're just caused by the underlying forces, not the cause of
well,
them.
I think that the fact that most people are under the wrong impression that we still have there's this population bomb concept. That was a book published, I think, in
Right.
1968 by Paul Ehrlich. People think that that's still true. So I think there's a lot of good people that can afford kids, that are well positioned, and who are very intentional. They're who are really under the belief that the most moral thing to do is not to have children. So I think the work that you're doing to raise the alarm about this, and inform the world that this is actually a crisis. Even, Elon Musk is drawing attention to the fact that there's a crisis, uh, you know, of people not having enough children as opposed to people having too many children, is a remarkably important uh
So
important piece of the puzzle, because I think people are, you have people that are very trying to do the right thing, and they think the right thing is to have less children, when actually that's going to lead to horrific problems in the future.
fertility decline's been going on for 250 years. Environmentalism was only a thing starting in the 60s, so it doesn't explain all the trend before the 60s. It seems to me like there is this much stronger, longer term trend that we're trying to understand and reverse. And I'd like us to at least temporarily focus on all the other cultures in world history that identified that they had a fertility problem and tried to do things about it, and what the track record there is. So, seems to me ancient Greece and ancient Rome both identified severe fertility problems, and their elites quite often, even the emperor of Rome, thought they saw a problem or did a bunch of big things about it and basically failed.
Yes,
As
yes.
right, as you
As
mentioned,
I've
France. French elites saw their fertility declining. They could predict that France would decline in influence in Europe. They wanted to do things about it, but they couldn't. They basically failed. In 1905, the US president said the biggest issue in the US at that point was Catholics outbreeding the Protestants, and they did not fix that, or that eventually changed, but not because of anything they did. It looks like we just have a long history in the world of cultures, when they identify fertility falls, try to fix it or not, it doesn't reverse.
Well, I would say, yes, the headwinds are very severe. There's no question about it, and it is not clear that this will be solved. We may be This decline may not be reversible, but I try to look at the possibilities of solutions, and that, my Twitter account, More Births, is focused on that. Um, I do want to, France, uh, their fertility is about where it was 100 years ago. So that's actually, in the
It's
face.
it's nicely high compared to Europe, but it's still below replacement.
You're right. You're right. You're right. So but turning from antenatal to pronatal culture in the 20th century has been a remarkably good thing for France. They were the sick man of Europe demographically, and got their hat handed to them in two world wars as a significant byproduct of that.
So now we
But
have the
but
embattled
but
again. The
but
same
but
solution as for
but
Israel
I,
worked
I
for
do want I
France.
do I do
Okay.
want to I do want to point out that, before, when they were antenatal, 100 years ago, they had, and for 100 years before that, they had the lowest fertility of any country in the world. And, they are, in the last almost a century, they have been in the top half of developed countries. So that's it's not
Right.
perfect, but it helps. And
Right.
one
But
thing I want to
that
emphasize, that every,
but
get it, a lot of things help. So we don't want to say there's no hope. Maybe we
okay,
do.
but if your best success story is still a failure,
Well, I would say the best success story is Israel, not France.
okay, but they're the
But
most embattled. So France is also embattled. So now you're saying like, well, we really need a big world war, and that'll boost fertility, and it'll only, if we only kill 5% of the world in a world war, and we have, vast fertility, that'll pay for itself. So
oh,
maybe,
geez.
there's an answer.
Well, uh, yeah. I mean, one thing, the reversal of Israel has been astonishing. One thing I've written about is actually, you know, in the 1800s, if you look at deeper history of the Jewish people before the establishment of the state of Israel, the fertility rate was incredibly low. Like Jewish people had been far below replacement, up until World War II. So actually, the reversal in Israel from adopting strong pronatal beliefs has been
But there
incredible.
wasn't a lever that was, oh, let's adopt strong natal release. It was the embattlement, plausibly, that caused the beliefs. The beliefs are a causal factor caused by other things. They're not just a knob we can
Well, we
turn.
do have a battle, which is that we do face actual, global demographic collapse, especially in the developed countries. So I would argue that there is a crisis that we can respond to. We're not, so I think
So I think most people even don't see this as such a crisis as you and I do, and that's part of the key problem. That
they
is,
will, they will.
I
Like
don't, I'm not, it's not obvious they will. That
reality,
is,
I think reality will come to them. I mean,
but
my most viral Twitter post was one about Japan, and the fact that uh, there was a paper. I'm sure you saw it. Essentially, all of we've talked about how everybody knows that Japan has been moribund for the last 3 decades, but Japan's economic, its GDP per uh, per working age person has been chugging along just fine. The thing that has been
right.
crippling Japan has been their demographic situation. So country after country after country is going to go through the same thing that Japan went through, being
And
more.
even
Yes.
Japan is not seeing it as a crisis, even at this moment. Not enough of a crisis to do enough that would change, reverse fertility decline. So then that's how it happened in Greece and Rome and all the rest of the empires in history. So, and even today, right, if you talk about these main trends, a lot of people are very emotionally attached to these key main trends, and they have a moral color to them.
Yeah,
They
I
think
was
it's
in Japan for 10 days with my family in September, and I really it was a cool country, but I felt very sad inside, actually, because everybody's going about their lives, and I know that this is a nation in decline for demographic reasons, and I felt like I saw the country better than the people saw it themselves.
so I feel like it, I mean, in my blog, I think honestly compels us to ask, well, if we don't solve this, what happens? And then my best guess is something like Haredi Jews or Amish, the small insular fertile subcultures we have now with very high fertility, they just keep growing, analogous to how the Christians took over the Roman Empire by doubling every 20 years for 3 centuries.
Yeah. There's a
That's the alternative
misconception.
scenario.
You're right, and there's a misconception. Oh, Christianity caused the fall of Rome. No, the fall of Rome was happening because they were in demographic collapse, and that you had this other group that just
Christianity saved them in some sense.
happened to have higher fertility. That was the what were the ones that remained when this this big
Right.
empire just collapsed
So
on its own.
so I feel like we should take seriously the idea that, maybe even more likely than not, this is how it'll play out. Our world culture will continue to fall, and we will be replaced by the descendants of very fundamentalist religious, insular fertile subcultures. And then the question is, how can we,
You know who else believes exactly that? I, I, you've talked to them. I think you've gotten to know them a little bit. There's a
the
couple.
Collinses,
Yeah, Simone and Malcolm Collins. They have
right?
this
But
exact
except,
same view. I
I
think
talked to
Elon
them
Musk is probably
again,
worried. You talk to them again, yes.
right? But the point is, like, well, they think, well, let's try to make a pro-fertile subculture among our friends. And, I think the problem with that is insularity. That is, a, I think this is a neglected feature in this entire discussion. Many people, like even including yourself, say, how can me and my friends make our local culture more pro-fertility? Let's have messaging, let's have, you know, whatever it is that would seem to promote that. But we are in a very integrated world culture, more so even than the Roman Empire, in the sense that through school and mass media, et cetera, when your children differ from, follow your lead, then they go out and mix in the world, and then
Yeah,
your
they're just
differences washes away in the
right. It'd be
ocean of
very
everything
hard to
else.
keep that in the long run. I think you're right. There is a group, uh, and I know quite a few of these people in the Washington D.C. area who have very high fertility and are also intensely integrated into the modern world, and that is I know a number of these people uh, uh, actually intensely pro-life Catholics, and there's a book coming out. Catherine Pakalak, I think
Okay,
is
but
the author. And well, let me finish. Just so like some of these people can have uh, you know 10. I know 4 families uh, within 2 miles of where I live that have 10 or more children, and all of these families are highly integrated. There is a close friend of mine who I watched the Super Bowl with just a
right.
few weeks ago. He's got 11 children. His eldest son, married young, and is continuing the tradition. His eldest son works at Google, so he, highly integrated into the tech economy and
I
also
mean,
maintain. So it is
but let's
possible.
walk it through. Like, if you have 10 kids, or some friends of yours have 10 kids, and then those kids go
I
out to
don't have
college.
I don't have
I know,
10 kids. But
let's imagine somebody
yeah,
in
yeah,
there,
yeah.
they have I don't know, dinner group. Say, imagine there's a dinner group of, 5 couples that get together regularly, and they each have 10 kids, right? Well, that's 50 kids. Now those 50 kids go out into the world and mix with everybody else and go to college and move away, and they marry random people in the world, and quickly this culture disappears, right? So in order to persist, these people would have to create some sort of cultural barrier where they have their kids marry each other and maintain this culture and its insularity. And it's the insularity that's really the most difficult factor. So if you look at the
Yeah,
Haredi Jews or the
yes.
Amish or the Mennonites, they have successfully insular cultures, and we can identify many of the
Well, the
factors
Amish
that
are not going,
contribute
you're
to
right.
that.
The Amish are not going to take us to Mars. They don't, if they
Not
don't,
yet. I mean,
if
maybe in a
they're,
thousand years they
if
would.
their, yeah, if their belief, this is not to knock the Amish, but they're known specifically, as you've said, I think, and as we all know, they're known for
But I think
rejecting
that's
technology.
downstream from their insularity. So I think, for example, they're also pacifist, as are the Haredi Jews. But I think we can understand their pacifism as a strategy to keep their sons from mixing with the rest of the world culture, rest of the society's culture, keeping them home. Similarly, I can think, they like a lot of technology. They just don't like technology that mixes them with other people, like, telephones and the internet and cars. But they don't mind like threshing machines and stuff like that. And in fact, the Amish have mostly made the transition from rural farming to rural business, which is pretty technology based.
But
They,
they're still insular.
yes, but they've maintained the insularity. So I think a lot of these features are, for example, when they have big enough communities to mount their own military divisions, then they won't be so pacifist anymore. They'll be able to
Interesting.
switch
Well,
because
I,
it's the insularity that's the key point.
I hear that. I hear that. I would argue this. I would argue that one reason why these insular subcultures are the only ones that we see with high fertility is because the global culture right now is fairly antenatal. But if the global culture were more pronatal,
Of
then you
course,
wouldn't have to be so insular
right. So
to.
those are the key big choices we face. This is what I want to highlight. Either you turn the ship of world culture and you turn it enough to get it above replacement, not up to France isn't good enough, or you throw in your lot with the insular fertile subcultures or make a new one. Those are the two paths by which eventually fertility rises. And that's the key question I wanted to highlight here. Most people talk about
Yeah,
one of the
I
options.
can't argue with that. That's impeccable logic. That is impeccable logic. Either we turn around the whole ship of global culture to be more pronatal, or it's
Right,
or the Amish and the Haredi Jews and whoever else.
right. So,
Uh,
right, I want to highlight the fact that the world is pretty diverse. And the world has a lot of cultural barriers between it. There are a lot of ways in which people from different parts of the world don't naturally get along with each other and work easily with each other. But the fact that the entire world has had falling fertility together suggests that there is, in fact, enough cultural integration in the world to pull everyone in the same direction. And
yeah,
here,
well, one thing I would counter. I mean, yes, I agree. I would also point out that what worked in a negative direction, this kind of collective global culture can hopefully also work in the in a positive direction as well. We saw the baby boom was a global phenomenon. You had a global culture that
well,
at the time.
baby boom was concentrated near the European countries who were most involved in World War One and Two,
Yeah, but it was well, the point is, yes, but it was a lot of countries. It wasn't.
right?
So that did show that
So
the
if we have a big enough world war, then we have hope.
or you can have a cultural movement that can be pronatal. I mean, the most pronatal culture that you may ever find in history was in the 1800s in the United States. And of course you had the Civil War, but that was just a few years of it. The growth of America from 1800 to like the early 1900s is the fastest that any country has grown anywhere, probably in the whole history of the world. And it's really remarkable. And they had this, you had this intense, pronatal culture. You had three different, Great Awakenings, which were national movements of a revival of religion and so forth. So you can have, uh, you know, you can have that. That's my hope, is that you have how we get to pronatalism. There's maybe a couple of different ways, but that's the hope, is that that the global ship of culture can turn toward pronatal. And you're right. If it doesn't, we
Right.
have a terrible problem.
But to turn the global ship of culture is not remotely enough to have some small set of dinner clubs have high fertility among their family,
Well,
right?
yeah.
You
Well,
have to
one
look
thing.
at something global in terms of culture.
Well, I would. Yeah, I mean that some people have written, if you want more than any kind of, more than almost anything, would be if Taylor Swift and what's his name, the tight end,
Right.
Travis Kelce, if they went and got married and started having kids, that might cause a little baby boom. So culture matters a lot. I would point also
But even that, I'm pretty sure is not enough.
well, I think it's a little bit earlier in the game than when we're willing to say. For example, no U.S. president, no head of state of the United Kingdom, no Canadian prime minister in recent memory has even mentioned the fertility crisis, has even suggested, even remotely, it's a good idea to have children. We're not we don't like they're not
Right.
even naming the
But
problem yet. So
I
I
mean,
think it's earlier than we think in terms of culture. But
let's
go.
take the example of the pandemic. It was a few years ago. Many of us would like to forget, but it's still there in recent memory. At the very beginning of the pandemic, the usual public health officials gave their usual advice about what to do. And then elites all around the world talked for a month intensely. And then at the end of that month, they came up with a different answer, which was contrary to the prior public health advice about what to do about the pandemic, which included travel restrictions and masks and things like that. And then basically the entire world did the same thing. The entire world followed the same policy there of the new elite policy. And say the most notable exception in the developed world was Sweden, who was roundly, denounced for their exceptionality. And in the end, it didn't turn out so bad for them. But like even having a whole country like Sweden defy world consensus was not enough to switch the rest of the world. That is, it's a matter of being a substantial fraction of the entire
Well, yes,
world
and
that moves things.
I did find a little bit of hope for the birth rate crisis regarding what happened in the pandemic, in the sense that we saw, global elite went in a certain direction, and they were able to take the whole world in a certain direction. And people can think what they want about whether it was the right way or the wrong way, but I was completely blown away. I would never have imagined that you could shut down all the schools all over the world, that you could have these I would never have imagined that everybody could walk around wearing masks. I would all over the world. I would never have imagined such a thing could happen, and it did. Like at the, at, you know, at the virtual drop of a hat in the scale of
Right?
history. So I do think that if global elites really properly became pronatal, I think remarkable things could happen.
Right. But having Taylor Swift change
Well,
is not so remotely enough to make the
oh no,
global elites
but
as a whole to do it, right?
I do think that the crisis is going to get very, very bad economically, in terms of technological progress, as you say. So that's the hope anyway,
But there'll be a slow boiling the frog problem. As people are already, as you noticed, collecting justifications and rationales for why our decline is a good thing and why it's not so bad and why we should, accept it anyway, because, hey, who should tell any one woman how many kids she should have? It should be entirely up to her and nobody should pressure her. And, and the environment is going to do better, et cetera. So there's already a lot of cultural resources building up to promote the current trend.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. We global elites could realize we better, start encouraging family formation. We better, get serious about this, or an alternative future is that we don't. I mean, one thing that I would point out is that hopefully it's a little bit easier for us than ancient Rome. I mean, ancient Rome, by some accounts, they needed to have a fertility rate of 6 births per woman. That was their replacement rate because they had such
But
high
of course, during the
infant.
rise, they did have that. So it was achievable then.
Right. So, and hopefully, since we were able to communicate with each other and, talk about the problem as we are
But
now.
the Romans and the Greeks could find each other and communicate and talk about the problem, which they did. They just didn't actually solve the problem
Yes.
because people so much wanted to keep in their cultural paths. That is, these major trends we've talked about, high parenting effort, long career paths, capstone marriages, etc. People feel very deeply that these are the ways we should be doing things, and that changes to them threaten their, deepest
Well,
values.
one thing, I want to point out again about the, kind of some of these kind of, maybe we could call them hardcore Catholics, uh, that I know, that are, I'm not fully,
Right.
I have these close these friendships, but one thing I wanted to say is that that some of these people, most they did not themselves, like this man, these people that I had watched the Super Bowl with, who had, very large families, they themselves did not come from that culture at all. They kind of adopted that in adulthood, and they themselves
Right.
figured it out as young adults, married later, but then became very pronatal, and then their children are.
So the best I can hope for them is they will succeed in creating an insular version of that culture,
Well, my
which then
point
can
is that,
perpetuate it, even no matter how they started, that they could keep going by becoming insular. And then
but they're
we
not
already,
in. My point is that this group, that I'm talking about, is not insular like the Amish.
well,
They're
that's the
pretty
problem. That's their
into.
problem. That's why
Well,
they will
well,
probably fail unless they can find a way to become insular. And we might want to help them do
but
that.
they do have high birth rates while being integrated, and that's kind of an anomaly.
But the world's big enough that any one couple could be an anomaly. The question is, can you make a sustained anomaly that builds over time? That's the harder question. In rare anomalies, I mean, there's just a lot of weird people in the world. So a lot of people are just going to do very different things, but
right,
the
right.
average is still going down.
Yes, it's very grim. The
Well,
the
I
path
really,
is
I mean,
yes.
I'm trying to make myself think it through, but I really think we should, have a plan B here where we ask, how can we put some of our investment into these insular fertile cultures that have demonstrated that they, if left to themselves, can in fact, solve the problem globally? And what can we do to support them or to, persuade them or to at least protect them? Because I fear that as they become a larger fraction of society, when we see how much they are defying all the rest of our values and doing it really different, we may repress them. We may decide that
Yeah,
we won't
that's
tolerate and allow that.
possible. I mean, I would think that the best way to invest in wouldn't be to support these insular subcultures. I think they probably I almost think that maybe they don't need our help or they have it figured out on their own. But I think, simply educating. I mean, for example, uh, sex ed in high school or, health class as we call it, it is 100% dedicated to teaching young people how to make sure that they never get pregnant. And if we, interestingly, it
And many
is
people love that, and they think
but
that's
I would,
moral, and they
there is
would
a
be
problem.
outraged by the opposite.
Well, there
That's
is
the
a
problem.
problem. Actually, unintended pregnancy is now much less common
It is.
than unintended childlessness. Unwanted childlessness is actually far more common than
But that only
unintended.
appears at the age of 40.
But I
Unintended
would argue
children can
that
appear at the age of
the
18, right?
easiest, most simple thing you could do is, change health class to, on the basis of the knowledge that we have now, that unintended childlessness is a big risk for all these high school kids, a bigger risk than accidentally getting pregnant. Now, if you look at the data,
Right. But the people in charge of sex education would hate this message, and their supporters would, strongly resist changing sex education to promote having sex,
maybe if global economies
fertility.
are collapsing on account of low fertility as they are likely to do,
Well, see,
then
I mean, if they collapsed all at once, then it would be a crisis. If there's just a slow decline, unfortunately, people get used to that. I mean, that's how it happened in Rome and Greece and in France, etc. Slow declines, people can tolerate and get used to. If it would happen all at once, then we'd be in much better shape. There would be a crisis and people could react to.
yeah, that's a big risk that that we're it's a boiling the frog situation. I think that's kind of what's happening, and people don't realize how drastically things have changed. I would use the Japan example. Japan is not a success story, let me be clear. However, and I was in Japan, in for 10 days in September, with my family. They are doing a hell of a lot better than South Korea. Japan and South Korea are very similar, but Japan's fertility rate is, I don't know, 1.3 births per woman. South Korea is at like
Right?
0.7. So
And France
almost,
is doing even better, but not good enough.
well, yes. I would say that I'll take every little bit helps. And if and Lyman Stone has often talked about this as well. Like if one thing doesn't get you all the way there, like that doesn't mean it's worthless. We gotta, it may be a collection of several things together that get us back to replacement.
So, as an economist, I think like an obvious answer is to just pay for fertility and let other people figure out what cultural changes they can to make that work. But in order for us to do that, we'd have to be willing to do that. I mean, I think we could even borrow the money to pay for it. So I think the key obstacle is a cultural willingness to solve the problem. That is, if we were just willing to say, yeah, we want to solve this problem, we don't know how, this would work, we would just say, okay, let's just pay enough and people would figure it out. But
Well, here's a
unfortunately, I
question.
don't think people will be willing to do this.
Well, there's another point, which is that you have talked about you want to kind of, you know, you know, tune this to those who will have I mean, the, that's not going to impact Elon Musk to have any more children at all. That would make no
He's a
difference to him.
tiny drop in the ocean, right?
Meanwhile, somebody who's, if you have a couple that's addicted to drugs and is trying to get their next fix, they're gonna rush out to make a bunch of babies to
So,
cash
right.
in.
So the solution here is not to pay the same cash amount per person, but to pay something more proportional to their ability to pay back in taxes, which is in fact to pay them a fraction of the kids' future taxes. So a simple,
Yes, I
that,
agree with that
that,
in principle. I agree with that in principle. I think, however, my fear or my thinking is that that would be very politically hard to sell. Like you would be like this, we would
it's
be,
not, it's mainly
you
hard
know,
to sell
that
because people aren't willing to solve the fertility problem. That
it
is their,
sounds that what you said, no, that sounds like somebody's going to figure out pretty quickly that they'll argue very quickly that this is regressive, which I don't like that term anyway, but that if you do more encouragement to people who are more economically productive, in the one hand, that's probably the kind of
right.
incentive that you want, but people, I can imagine it
But I
getting,
think every other solution has the same sort of problem in spades, right? If you say, well, let's make housing easier, there's all these people lined up to say, oh no, if you make housing easier, that's going to like cause this problem and that, because that's the reason why we have difficult housing now is because of all these other interests who say we're protecting you from all these problems by making housing hard. And every other
well,
solution in the
housing is an interesting uh, situation. We have extremely high levels of immigration right now, but I'll talk about Canada specifically because Canada has this problem much worse. Canada's birth rate keeps going down to like almost to like probably I think they're lower than Japan now. So just shocking collapse of fertility in Canada. And what's happening, and this is a huge national issue that's causing the conservatives to rise up in Canada, is that the extreme levels of immigration that Canada's immigration levels are many times, several times the number of births that they have. So uh, what
right.
what seems to be happening is that they have and such an extreme level of immigration that it's actually driving down the birth rate through the mechanism of making housing incredibly unaffordable in Canada. So there's a factor there that
Right.
is to think about as well.
Right, but the point is that all of these trends have a lot of support behind them and a lot of resistance for any laws that would undermine these trends. And
Well,
so,
I would say,
so I still think like just paying for it is the simplest thing, even though you'll face some opposition, it'll be less opposition than trying to reverse five of these other trends.
well, I would argue that what we saw with COVID was, the elites, you know, panicked enough or, got anxious enough that that eventually there was motivation for
Right. But I
massive
mean,
societal changes.
but
So,
as you know, quite often when elites get panicked and then have to do something, the thing they do doesn't actually work. So there is the problem. We need to point them toward a very simple thing they can't mess up that much to fix the problem. And I fear
well, I
many,
hope
if you
they should
point them to
follow.
this long list of things, they'll mostly mess them up.
Well,
They won't actually fix it.
they should follow more births because I will talk about many factors. That's one thing I focus on is factors that are correlated with fertility. That's my main focus. So I
You
they're
give them
gonna
a
have.
longer menu of things they can fiddle with, they're just going to mess it up more, I'm afraid. You need to give them a simple, concentrated answer. Just do this one thing you say, and that could work. Then you
Yeah,
have a chance they might
I
do
would say
something close to it.
if I could say, one thing, I would say, you know, uh, try to build a pronatal culture, and then within that, people
But
can
that's
come up
just a
with their.
summary of all the other
co-
factors. It's not a
Well,
separate factor.
I think it is a separate factor because as I keep pointing to Israel, they have all
But
these
Israel
factors.
isn't a separate pronatal factor. They have a whole bunch of other, as you said, the embattlement is a pretty big factor there.
Well, I think we will have an.
And religion.
Yeah, I
So I
think
mean,
I think we will have our own battle, if you will. I mean, a symbolic battle, if you will, the battle of uh of declining civilization and declining global economies and declining innovation. So we will have our crisis. So we will have our siege in a sort of weird sense, if we can see it as that. And I don't know if we'll solve it.
well, so I mean, there's several steps here. First is people have to think they see a problem that they are willing to do substantial amounts about. Secondly, they'll have to correctly diagnose it and correctly pick something that will actually fix it rather than just hand out rents to people and not, and have a motion of doing something, but not actually do effective things. And of course, you'll have to sustain, even if you did the right thing, you'll have to sustain it in the light of how it turns out. So I think even if we did this, giving parents a percentage of their kids' taxes thing, and we made a really large amount, and then it actually started to work, what we would see is that in the groups of people who are starting to have lots of kids from this payment, they would reverse some of these key trends. They might have less parenting effort, or, drop off of career paths or do cornerstone marriages. And then when people saw that, they would be pissed. They would be unhappy because they would see how they were defying many treasured value trends like the Amish and Ready Jews do now. And they might not be willing to sustain it.
Well, I'm a really big believer in freedom, and that's why I really uh think that, like, sort of raw pronatal messaging is kind of a good way, because then people can arrive at that in their own way. If a woman wants to, have a high-powered career and somehow manage, through, having 5 au pairs, to have 10 kids that way, and win the prize, the Presidential Medal of American maternal glory, or something like that. People can find however they want to do it. If somebody else wants to go old school with a.
But that's the point of the monetary payment. I think monetary payment has a much longer and clearer history of effectiveness than propaganda
Well,
as
okay,
moving behavior, right?
I hear that. One thing I would point to was, under Clinton, there was they had a welfare reform, because there was a belief that people were, just one generation after another, were supporting themselves simply by you know simply by doing this, by welfare payments. And and, and you know and, and so so there was a bipartisan effort led by Bill Clinton to kind of reform the welfare system in the 1990s. And so there was that. And I understand that the system is supposed to, is supposed to be engineered around that. But I worry that
They
you
did
would.
improve things, right? That was, in fact, an improvement. The welfare
So,
reform, Clinton's welfare reform. And so that does show the potential effect of
but I don't know.
monetary
I would it
policy.
would even it would even something like that, which would even something like that be feasible in the political climate today? Because what you're talking about is something that it would look regressive, to use a term. I don't, as
Okay,
I.
but the on the table, you and I'm advocating financial policies, and you're advocating rhetorical policies,
Well,
basically.
I would say try to build a pronatal culture. I do believe that culture.
But
It,
these are
it,
all the elements of culture. All these things like career paths, et cetera, these are parts of culture. That's what I've been trying to talk about. The more fundamental parts of culture contributing to this.
I think.
Pronatalism isn't a separate part of culture. It is the net effect of all these other parts of
Well,
culture.
I would argue that, taking an Occam's razor approach, you can kind of, separate out pronatal belief a little bit. And what I do believe is that, these different examples that I try to show in my in my article, Fertility and Culture, a deep dive. What I try to show is that you can take that pronatal belief and overlay that on a bunch of different systems. You can, as I say, somebody can be a feminist, they can,
Well,
and be a pronatalist. Somebody can be a traditionalist, be a pronatalist. They can be right wing, they can be left wing, they can, all these things. They can have all these. They can be urban and be pronatalist too. So that factor can.
okay. So, I mean, I think I've learned something from our conversation here, and maybe you have too,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
that it's a question really rather than an answer, but it's a question we could investigate in further. Maybe we could, come back and meet and discuss it more when we thought about it and maybe figured out more. The question is, to what extent is being pro or antenatal a separate, independent cultural factor that is somewhat autonomous from the other cultural factors influencing fertility? Uh,
I
and to
I
what
yeah.
and to what degree can it overwhelm the other factors? That's
I
the
think it's huge. You had an incredible religious movement in the 1800s. It was the Shaker movement.
but that was
They
religion, not pronatalism. I mean, you
but
can't.
they had all sorts of religious fervor. They got lots of disciples, lots of converts. They had a belief in not having children. And nobody, and I've never in my life met a Quaker, a shaker.
Yeah.
So I think.
So I mean, I'm happy. Like I said before, I'm happy to admit that religious dogma when supported by a religion people believe in, can have substantial effect on behavior. That's different than pronatalism separate
But
from religious
I would
dogma,
argue
right?
that what a big part of the effect that we see, why religious groups do tend to have much higher fertility is that uh, part of their beliefs is a pronatal belief, and in a culture where the broader culture is relatively antinatal, this group of people that have a pronatal belief are going to
Right.
stand out dramatically.
Right. But I mean, you and I are framing that situation in two different ways. You're thinking of the religion as upping this pronatal thing, which is a separate factor. And I'm thinking of the religion more fundamentally as the factor with its dogma causing the behavioral change. The question is, outside of the context of a religious dogma, to what extent is there a separate pro or antenatal cultural factor that is somewhat, autonomous from all the other factors that we can identify causing higher or lower fertility?
That's a really great question. That is, and it is, I don't know. I don't know of any cultural groups that have managed to sustain above replacement fertility in the world today that are not
Religious,
transmitting this. Yes, exactly, exactly.
right?
So
And
there's
so
a
maybe the elephant in the room here, which we should talk about more sometime, is just the prospects for religion in the future. That is, elite culture, world elite culture is not very religion friendly at the moment.
correct.
But could they be more? Are there prospects for moving the ship of world culture in that dimension? It does seem like if you're looking at one of the factors that we might reverse to promote fertility, it does seem like one of the more unlikely ones that we could reverse given how strong the trend has been. But that may be what, the essential part. I don't know. But
Yeah,
yes,
this is a big open question. I would do cartwheels. I would probably cry with joy if I found a group that was, sort of technological, even maybe even politically left wing, that kind of the that Simone Malcolm Collins referred to an urban monoculture, which I think there's some truth to that, to that way of thinking. But if I found a group that was highly connected with that, and highly educated, based in universities, and pushing the edge and envelope of technology, that was also successfully pronatal, I would be so happy, and I'm sure you would be too, to find that.
right. So we have to, I mean, again, there's the two main strategies are
And
to
Simone
change
and
this.
Malcolm Collins, that's what they think about all the time, is how to develop such a culture. I
Right.
don't.
And I think their main issue is, can they not only develop it, make it insular enough to last? And that's another big demand.
Well,
I believe,
as you said, there's two options. There's the insular option, or or
change.
turning the Titanic around and shifting world culture in a pronatal direction. And you think that that's impossible. I would argue that the crisis is going to get so bad, economic decline, innovation decline, as you say, that the global elites will be spending a lot of their day thinking about this. So that's the hope, maybe.
I mean, unfortunately, I think the decline will be slow and gradual enough. I mean, I actually think like we're not in the decline, we're not going to lose electricity or running water or sanitation or things like that. Per capita wealth might decline modestly, but we'll be basically in a modern
We will
world.
lose it in some places, particularly, maybe there's a lot, in rural areas that are depopulating. One thing that I saw in my
Well,
trip to
basically,
Japan is that in Japan, in Tokyo, everybody is actually migrating to
right, and
Tokyo. So,
that's how we predicted it happened. That we should just empty out many cities and towns and concentrate
but then
people in
Japan
full
has the
towns.
added problem that since everybody keeps flocking, all the young people keep flocking to Tokyo, which has the lowest fertility in all of Japan, you have this
Right?
continuous population sink
Sure.
effect, which
But I
is.
mean, the point is that'll continue. Many cities and towns will empty out. And I've written about other sorts of, ways software will bite the world, but I still think it'll mostly be a relatively rich modern world. If, of course, economic decline went so far as to make us impoverished, then poverty might produce fertility like it has in history. But I don't
Well,
think that's really going to save us.
I do think that the economic hits are going to be stronger than almost anybody realizes, because if you look at where this fertility crisis is hitting, it is hitting precisely the most technological countries. The country with the highest per capita patenting rate in the whole world is guess who?
Japan?
South Korea.
Huh?
So they have been the most innovative country on so many things. I mean, you can look, I don't know, my
Right,
phone is made in Korea, but I bet I wouldn't be surprised
right.
if your phone is made in Korea.
And
They're
so
so technological.
right? And so innovation will fall faster than population probably, in
Yeah,
part
yeah,
because of this. I mean, it's
right.
also that, the last place to peak population wise will be Africa. And so if they don't have the same per capita innovation as the West, then innovation would start falling well before population peaks.
Sure, sure. So it's gonna get worse
But
than
again,
people
through
can
most of history,
possibly imagine.
people had pretty low innovation rates and they didn't see it as a crisis. So the question is, how easily can people slip back into the usual patterns of history where things are static and they don't mind?
Yeah, it's an open question. Will people realize that they're frogs that are boiling?
Well,
It's
thank you, Daniel, for talking to me.
Thank you so much. This was an incredible conversation. We covered an unbelievable amount of ground.
And apparently there's still more we could cover in a future conversation.
Yes, this is the possibility of civilizational collapse. My goodness.
All
Thinking of
right.
Rome. Do guys think of Rome? I do.
Think of the collapse of Rome
Yeah,
and the collapse of Greece, which people don't know as much about.
yeah, yeah.
All right.
So
Well,
we'll
till
talk.
till we talk again.
Yeah, till we talk again.
All
It
right.
was wonderful.
Bye, Daniel.
Thank you.